And when we come to the end of this story, probably one of the hardest things for each of us to accept is the death of David's child. Many people will read this passage and say, but how could a loving God allow an innocent child to die? It's a difficult question. But it might help us to remember that as we read this story, God is not punishing the child. God is punishing David for what he has done. The child's death was a consequence of David's rebellion, David's disregard for God's law. This isn't meant to be an expression of God's cruelty. And of course, as we read this narrative, we discover that David's grief for this child was overwhelming. Scripture tells us that David fasted. He wept for this child. He lay on the ground for days pleading, God, spare the child. In fact, the account tells us that his servants feared that David would die from sorrow. God was showing David the cost of his sin, that sin always brings death, and that rebellion against God in one way or another, it steals life from someone else. But even in this painful moment, we can see glimpses of God's mercy. The child that died was not abandoned. Scripture tells us that David found comfort because he knew that the child had gone to be with God. And that's why David says in verse 23, I will go to my son, though he will not return to me. In other words, David is telling us, my child is in the arms of God, and one day I will go to him. And so, yes, we see that the Lord was bringing justice for what David had done, but we discover that the Lord was also being merciful by taking the child into his arms, welcoming him into heaven, into paradise.